welcome to the Libertarian Listener with me, Chris Wilkinson. In today's show, I'm joined by Libertarian activist Will Taylor. He's been talking to me today about the anti-lockdown protests, the new stricter COVID tiers, and the possibility of a vaccine, and the ongoing virus testing. Okay, so the first topic for today is on the anti-lockdown protests. Obviously, winter's on its way, and the colder weather's going to encourage people indoors over the coming few months. Have more people been turning up to these anti-lockdown rallies since they first started, or have the numbers been fairly consistent?
I can't really comment on anything that's outside of Hull, because I haven't been travelling around to places like Liverpool and Manchester and Leeds and so on. The ones that we've been doing in Hull, I'd say have dwindled a little bit recently during the lockdown. I don't know if that's weather related. It could be. I mean, we had a chap called Graham Moore. He came up here. He's like an English constitutionalist. Not really my cup of tea, but he had some interesting things to say. He had a small turnout, and the weather was lovely. Absolutely lovely. So I'm not convinced it's weather related. I think partly it's down to the fact that we are in full lockdown and there is just no excuse. I think people are put off by the idea of breaking laws and getting arrested. The prospect of getting arrested is scary for most people, even those who are anti-lockdown. In Hull, we've been struggling to get the message out. Facebook really have cracked down on our group posts, and despite the fact that we're sharing it left, right and centre, we have like 2,000 people in our local anti-lockdown Facebook group, and we don't hear a peep, and if you go into it manually, there's loads of stuff in there. We've done two events recently, 2 marches. We decided we weren't going to do like a static protest, because too much organising, too much risk of the police moving us on, that kind of thing. We basically said we'd just go for a walk. Yeah. And the first one we had, which was a couple of weeks ago, we arranged it like 24 hours notice. I think we had something like 50 to 60 people turn up. And then we had one on Saturday. And the weather was pretty poor, to be honest. But most of the people who turned up were the hardcore anti-lockdown activists, and often they're people from like Lincoln, Leeds. We had some people from Hartlepool who travelled. So we've got people travelling the country to attend these local events, and they're not actually local people.
So we've both been involved in lockdown protests, and it certainly seems as though the role of the police in maintaining order during these events has varied depending on what region you're in. So in Hull, they were excellent, and yet in London, we've seen pictures of brutality and the use of unreasonable force against essentially defenceless individuals. What have some of the key considerations been when either organising or attending a protest that you feel could help maintain order and reduce the risk of police violence to those attending?
It's not just London. I mean, London's been the worst. Hull, in my experience, has been the best. We haven't had any bother from the police whatsoever. Been nothing but friendly and supportive. Then we've had Leeds. I've seen the videos from Leeds. They weren't as bad as London, but they were very, very much less tolerant. South Yorkshire police, quite a lot of zealotry from there, quite heavy-handed. I think they arrested Piers Corbyn as well. I guess one of the things you've got to do is you've got to play by the rules. That's one of the things that we get in this anti-lockdown movement. There's a lot of common law stuff floating around. And it's like this common law is just another conspiracy theory that they're advocating an alternative legal system which does not exist. They like to think that they know what they're talking about, and actually they know very little. There is such a thing as common law, and it's not what they're talking about. They're talking about, I'm a sovereign human being and all that kind of thing. They're prattling on about the Magna Carta, which, to be honest, hasn't been recognised in hundreds of years. There are, I think, 3 bits of the Magna Carta that's still valid, and none of the things they're talking about are still valid. So when they're using the Magna Carta and their common law rights to this and their common law right to that, for freedom of assembly and all that, that just doesn't wash with the police. The police enforce statute law, by and large, and some common law crimes, in fairness, the common law crime of murder. Murder is not a statutory crime. Obstruction of a police officer, I don't think, is a statutory crime. I think that's a common law crime. But by and large, the Public Health Act, which is the act of Parliament under which all of the coronavirus restrictions have been created. That's their world: acts, regulations, and statutory instruments. And I think you've got to play by those rules. And within those rules, there are a considerable number of loopholes for us to exploit. And so if we go back to Trafalgar Square, the one in September, which Kate Shirmani organised, and I was there, and I took a whack to the face from Constable Chowdhury, and that hadn't been risk assessed, or at least they hadn't followed the process properly. So the process is that you could get an exemption to the rule of 6 if you'd done a risk assessment which complied with health and safety legislation, and if you'd taken all reasonable measures to limit the risk of coronavirus. I think they had a risk assessment, but they hadn't had it accepted by the council. Either way, the police weren't aware of it. Furthermore, Kate Shirmani, I mean, right from the offset, and I've got a lot of time for what Kate Shirmani said on the day, and I was in the line against the police, and I obstructed a police officer in the course of his duties. But what did she do? She incited violence almost. She almost incited rebellion when she was talking about men rise up. I mean, what the hell do you expect is going to happen if you do that kind of thing? So I don't think we play by the rules. I mean, we did one in Hull, fully risk assessed. We had signage up. You know, I'm a chartered health and safety professional. That's my profession. I deal with the law all the time. I can do risk assessments. I can tie people up in knots, most people up in knots on law. And our event, absolutely fine. It's probably more Humberside police than our risk assessment, in fairness. But I think you've got to play the game. And we don't do that.
Do you think that the lockdown protests have been effective in changing the minds of our political representatives, or at least bringing to light the serious externalities that lockdown has caused? We've had increases in suicides, untreated cancer and heart disease, worsening mental health, jobs being lost, and businesses closing their doors for the final time.
To some extent, it hasn't really changed the minds of the political representatives who truly matter. I don't think we're arguing against the real reason they're doing this. And I'm no conspiracy theorist. I know there was a lot of talk about the Great Reset and all that kind of thing, and I think there's definitely some truth to that. But is that the big motivating factor behind this? No, I think the bottom line is Boris and co. I like to call him Neville, like Neville Chamberlain, because he is a Neville Chamberlain. But Neville knows full well he's messed things up. And I think Matt Hancock does as well. I think they're not stupid. And I think Sage, there's a lot of conflicts of interest within Sage, so I can understand why Sage might be pushing a certain narrative. You know, they've got their reputations, their funding, they've got their own financial vested interests. They lack the expertise in immunology. The question is why? If they know it's all nonsense, I think it's simply down to protection of reputations.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what facts and scientific evidence you present to that. Ultimately, Boris or Neville knows that if they turn around over the next week or two and say, we've carefully reviewed the scientific data, and I'm afraid we kind of overreacted, and we've trashed the economy when we didn't really need to. And it's actually even worse than that. Somewhere in the region of 30,000 elderly people, didn't just die unnecessarily, but were actually euthanized. We withdrew their food and water and medical treatment and put them on morphine so they could die a peaceful, quiet death. That didn't have to happen. And I'm afraid, we'll just go back to normal now. You can't go back to normal.
No.
That is not just the end of their reputation. I genuinely think some people would go to prison.
Yeah.
And I don't think they could admit it. So it's at best, it's the end of their career, and they will be remembered for all of history as the people who caused tens of thousands of deaths, savaged an economy, and caused a wound that's going to last at least 10 years, probably longer. And at worst, that's the best case scenario. At worst, it's prison. They're going to carry on playing this game until we get to about May, June. And then they'll turn around and say, hey, look, coronavirus is gone. It worked. Well done, team.
I do quite agree with that analysis, yeah. it seems as though they're lying now to cover up the lies that they told earlier, which covered up the biggest lie of all, which was to act to defeat this virus in the first place. So now we're moving on to the lockdown tiers, which are even stricter than before. So by the time this episode's going out, the UK would have moved into the lockdown-esque system of stricter tiers. Apparently a lockdown rebellion has been mounted by the more disgruntled Conservative MPs, angry at the increasingly centralised approach to COVID restrictions and echoing the concerns of their constituents. I've got a quote from the Daily Mail here that says, "Ministers warn it could be summer before UK gets back to normal as Boris Johnson faces revolt by up to 100 Tory MPs over brutal new tiers, with more evidence cases are already tumbling. The country will face a national lockdown if MPs reject new local limits," the PM has warned, to stave off a rebellion. But the Imperial College study shows that cases have fallen by a third since the second national lockdown began. Rebels demanded hard evidence to convince them that the crackdown will save more lives than it will cost. Now, contained within that is evidence of the fact that there is a political motive behind the government's measures and not a scientific one. What are your thoughts on this?
I'll play devil's advocate with this one. I think that was one way of looking at it, and I would tend to agree. But I think plausibly you could make the case that you have to do something to control the infections, to control the virus. And his proposal is to move away from lockdown to this local tier system. And if the rebels don't let him do that, well, his point is, well, we have to do something. If you won't let us do the tiers, then we'll just have to continue with the lockdown. Because that's better than nothing. Still, nothing is not an acceptable alternative in his reality. Boris has revealed himself to be a hell of a lot more authoritarian than we've given him credit for. And it's interesting that he's making these little veiled threats now. The thing we've realised, Boris, and many people realised this long before I did, is that Boris bends with the wind. It's all about public opinion. It's about reputation. And ultimately, it's about his career. Let's look at the man personally, with his personal life. He's not exactly a man of great integrity, is he?
No.
I mean, you just look at his family life, look at the amount of women that he's been through, quite literally, whilst married. And, I'm no perfect individual, but there is a reason why I decided to step back from politics a little bit. And that's because I realized that if I can't do the basics in life, which is be a good husband, be a good father, be good at my job, maybe start a small business, I'm really not qualified to lecture anyone on the NHS or welfare or anything more complicated.
So why do you think they've tarred large regions with the same brush indiscriminately without devolving responsibility to the local levels so that restrictions can be tailored to their particular areas? I've got a quote from the Mirror here. It says, just 18 local areas in England are currently recording a rise in COVID-19 cases, with all 297 other regions having a fall in cases. Of those 18 areas where rates are increasing, 8 will be placed in Tier 3 of the government's COVID-19 restrictions from Wednesday, December 2nd. The other 10 areas where the rate is also increasing will be going into Tier 2. Now, even by their own warped logic, that surely doesn't make any sense if the aim is to stop the risk of spreading the disease.
I think deciding on what I've read on this, deciding on the tiers, what tier you belong in, is a little bit more complicated than just looking at the increase in cases. From memory, I can't remember all of the criteria, but from memory, there are things like the capacity of the NHS, number of beds available, number of ventilators available, the kind of surge capacity they've got. I think they might have things like population density and the demographics of the population, the elderly, the BAME communities and that kind of thing. So I think they take all of that into account, and that might explain some of those differences as to why some went into Tier 3, some went into Tier 2. But you're right to your point about why don't they just leave that down to local leaders? Well, 2 reasons, I guess. I mean, one, and again, I'm going to be generous here to the government. One is you could argue that the local leaders are to some extent biased. to keep things open. They've got a local community who need to live and earn livings and trade and all the rest of it. And they are directly accountable to their local community. So can the local leaders be trusted to make the right decision according to public health? Probably not. I dare say, and this is where I'm going to be a little bit less generous to the government, is I think there's an element of ego and control freakery with this as well. The bottom line is that they do have a large ego. That's why they made it to the top of the hierarchy. And they don't trust anyone else to make these kinds of decisions. They think they are right. This is why they're not listening, because they have an ego problem. They think they are right. And we can see that in their behavior. It doesn't matter what you say to them. It's just deaf ears all the time. And people with an out of control ego are often control freaks. They will not allow more junior people to make decisions because, I mean, I see this every single day in business. You know, I see this in management, and it causes all kinds of problems. And we like to think government are better than that. Like, they're not. They're not at all. They have all of the flaws that a small business of, say, 50 or 100 people has. It's just that the consequences are magnified by a factor of 1 trillion.
There's been much talk of the cure being worse than the condition in more recent weeks, which I suppose is a view better taken later than never. But this is still to translate into real action in policy terms. So how can ministers and indeed the government justify their subordination to the recklessness of the lockdowns, the tiers, social distancing and wearing of masks when the amount of non-COVID deaths is outnumbering the number of COVID deaths?
Oh, quite easily. They just get the media to conveniently gloss over the non-COVID deaths as much as they can. You know, we've got these Ofcom coronavirus broadcasting guidelines. And this is the attitude I think Facebook and YouTube take. There's this idea that to be socially responsible, you can't counter the narrative, because if you do, people might stop socially distancing. They might stop wearing their masks. They might go out more, and that could cause more deaths. So there's a real reluctance or a refusal to broadcast or publicize anything which could encourage people to behave normally. So whilst the press is on side with this, I think the government, all they have to do is just keep hammering home the message that people are dying, and if we overwhelm the NHS this winter, then even more people are going to die, and that ultimately the health impact will be so enormous that the economic damage will just pale in comparison. And then they even use the argument that the health impact will be so enormous, it will also damage the economy. Yeah, because it's not good for the economy to kill off all your customers. It's not good for the economy if people are dropping down dead left, right, and centre, which is what we think they are doing. The economy started to slow down long before the first lockdown. I remember in March, we were talking about this virus that had arrived in the UK. It was starting to freak people out early March. And I went into Hull city centre, and Hull's like, we're not exactly a central hub of activity here. Yeah. What a city centre, which is, quiet at the best of times. But I tell you what, we went out on 3 weekends in a row. It was dead. We stopped going out simply out of fear. That was before Project Fear started. It was before the media really started ramping up. It was before the psychological operation from the government started. So for all of our willingness to blame the government on this, I think the British population were just freaked out already. And it didn't take much to completely scare us into submission. It's like, how many people do you see breaking rules, Chris? How many people are not wearing masks? I mean, I bet I used to see maybe 10%, 5%. Now it's like, I barely see one person. It's like everyone's fallen in line, or nearly everyone's fallen in line.
Okay, so the final topic for today is on virus testing and the vaccine. Got a quote from The Independent to start, which says, further rollout of a rapid coronavirus testing machine in English hospitals is set to be paused due to difficulties in operating the technology. High hopes were initially raised over the machines, which, once delivered and installed, would have been able to process roughly 60,000 samples a day. During the first rollout of the devices, hospitals from a range of trusts warn that they did not have the necessary ancillary products or staff needed to operate the machines. Hospital figures have argued that the procedure, which also requires large protective safety cabinets to prevent exposure and contamination of samples, is too complex and time demanding. Now, does this confirm that the NHS is still not prepared to deal with the virus despite the fact that lockdown was supposed to protect it? And why do you think this is the case, if it is?
I guess it's a government which is, I mean, I guess this is part of Operation Moonshot, isn't it? This idea that they were going to test like everybody once a day or something. Yeah, really, when you're in government, what we want is competence more than anything else. And with competence is the ability to put in the planning work, do the detail. And they don't do detail at all. If you're going to get these are basically large high-tech PCR testing machines. And yeah, you do need highly trained staff. You need all kinds of chemicals and samples and vials. You need these massive fume cabinets with extraction equipment. You need space for them. You need to be installed. They need, ducting, and, they need to be put in a special room with, which is kind of hermetic and with a controlled environment to stop all the contamination. It's like, no, they didn't do the detail on that. They don't think to listen. Yeah. Instead of asking the hospitals, hey, we would really like you to use these machines. Here are the details. Is there any way you can make this work? What do you need to make this work? Instead of having that kind of conversation, what is a true and proper consultation with your staff? They've said, here you go, these machines. Yeah. Get it working. Yeah. So they've gone, can't get this to work. Like, where are we going to put them? I've got the staff. So yeah, it's just reputation, poor planning, incompetence, rushing into things without doing the groundwork and the detail.
What's the point in mass testing when the results of such tests are only feeding the government's power trip and being used as an excuse to implement more draconian freedom-destroying measures? It's
a charade up. That's all. They have to keep this charade up until May or June. They have to convince us that there are cases in the community, so they can keep it all going until we get the vaccine. And I bet once this vaccine has been rolled out, what will probably happen is we'll have a new test, or they'll change the test methodology, especially the PCR test. They'll dial down the number of amplification cycles, and so we don't get as many false positives. That'll bring in a massive drop in the case numbers, combined with the fact that we'll have a vaccine, which probably will work to some extent at preventing the infection or preventing the positive results. May or June, we'll just see the cases plummet, and then they can say, hey, look, it worked. But in the meantime, they need to keep feeding the case-demic.
I've got a quote from Birmingham Mail here. It says, Matt Hancock has said, every week we are getting more positive news about the range of vaccines in development. And thanks to the work of our task force, the UK has pre-ordered hundreds of millions of doses from those companies most advanced in their work. This includes buying a further 2 million doses of Moderna's vaccine, on top of the 5 million we've already secured. With a wide range of vaccine candidates in our portfolio, we stand ready to deploy a vaccine should they receive approval from our medicines regulators, starting with those who will benefit most. So do you think that a vaccine that has gone from zero to roll out within a year will be effective, be safe to use, and resolve the coronavirus issue we're confronted with? Or are we looking at a more permanent loss of liberty around the world, regardless of any vaccine to combat the virus?
Nothing is safe. It's a question of risk. So you have low risk, you have high risk, and you have everything in between. And there's a risk in absolutely everything that we do. And it's a question of trade-offs. Overall, I believe that most vaccines, on balance, have more benefits. As in the benefits outweigh the risks. There are risks. Yeah. And the risks are not well publicized, for one. They are kind of swept under the carpet, admittedly. And there are millions of people who suffer side effects, and there are issues around the legal liabilities of manufacturers in all of this. And yet, on balance, vaccines have saved many more lives than they have taken, and also many more lives than they've ruined from their side effects. And the side effects are typically pretty minor. with a tiny minority of severe side effects. Now, that being said, does that mean that any of these coronavirus vaccines are safe or low risk? Well, we don't know. Yeah. That's the bottom line. This is why I won't be taking the vaccine. I just don't know, because most vaccines take about 10 years to come to market. Do I think the COVID vaccine's safe? Haven't got a clue. We haven't got the long-term safety data. That's the bottom line. And so we've got an unknown risk. Now, I dare say the risk is probably quite low. There's probably a very low likelihood that we're going to have ill health effects, but we just don't know. That's just my guess. Why would we take a vaccine which has an unknown level of risk? I mean, even if the risk is incredibly low, let's say the risk is like 0.02% of us might suffer a serious side effect. Why would we take it? Because there's a lot less than the 0.02% chance of us getting any kind of serious side effect from the coronavirus. I mean, as is it mandatory? Is it going to lead to an erosion of freedoms? I think where we're going with this is it's down to this libertarian issue, this issue libertarians have, which is we're being asked more and more to put our own interests below that of the interests of society and the community. So we're being asked to sacrifice our own good and our own health in the interests of other people. And the thing is that you can actually see why that might be a good thing to some extent. I mean, there does have to be some give and take in a community. You have to be prepared in any society, in any relationship, to sometimes play the game and to do things you don't entirely agree with in order to maintain stability. You know, sometimes I just have to go along with the things that my boss says or my wife says or my colleague says because I'm a team player. Some of this self-sacrifice is kind of necessary, but where do we draw the line, and who gets to force us to comply when we don't want to? We should be free to choose to not cooperate and take the risk of being ostracized, the risk to damage to reputation, the risk of losing friends and allies, if that need be. But that's our choice to make. We have to weigh up those risks.
It's been a very interesting discussion. Thanks for joining me. And,
thanks for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
That's all right. I think we're heading over to 5 Minutes with Ed.
Hello there and welcome to 5 Minutes with Ed on the Libertarian Listener. I am Ed Saunders. This week we've seen the introduction, or the supposed introduction, depending upon whether or not Parliament gets through, although I really do believe that they will, of the new 3-tier system in England. Now, it's rather interesting because it appears that it's actually, it's essentially locked down in everything but name. A large amount of the country is in Tier 3, and then virtually the rest of the country is in Tier 2. The Tier 3 restrictions are essentially the same as what we have at the moment. There's very, very little difference. Maybe you can go to the odd shop which the government deems in their infinite wisdom to be non-essential, but I'd say that's about it. Having said that, any shop which has been closed for that period of time it is rather unlikely to be open given the massive economic strain that has been put on the country due to the coronavirus crisis, or more accurately, the government's handling of it. It's quite interesting. There are about 2 places, I think 2 or 3 places that are in Tier 1. I believe it is the Isle of Wight, the Scilly Isles and Cornwall. Or South Cornwall or something like that. There are lots of MPs that have their holiday homes in those particular locations, just want to put it out there. And in other news, Tier 2 places, hospitality can reopen, but you cannot serve alcohol unless there is a substantial meal involved. Now, of course, MPs all tend to go out for business lunches and so forth, paid for by expenses. The rest of us can't really afford to be eating out, but it all seems to have boiled down to the precise weight of a scotch egg which is needed to constitute a substantial meal under the new legislation. In the Tory party, it seems as though Steve Baker is going to lead a rebellion of potentially up to 100 Conservative members of Parliament, mainly on grounds of liberty and the effect that liberty, proportionality and the effect which this whole response to the coronavirus has had on the economy. I don't think it's going to make a blind bit of difference, but it is somewhat kind of encouraging to see that at least some people may share these views, although having said they are somewhat of a dying breed in the Tory party, and have been replaced with kind of the new Tories, as it were, Matt Hancock, Priti Patel and the like, and of course our dear leader Boris Johnson. But there we go. Rather interesting, 100 Rebels. It seems like it should be the name of a country music album, but anyway, the Labour Party is going to abstain from the vote, but only on the basis that they wanted things to be done sooner and more strictly. It seems that essentially these days the Conservative Party just wants to lock everything down, close everything up, tell people where and when they shouldn't do and when they should do things and what have you. And the job of Her Majesty's opposition is just to say that you should have done it before, rather than to provide any actual opposition to it. They've abstained, but this will mean, of course, that the Conservatives will, the government will win the vote due to the fact that the majority of Conservatives will be voting with along the line of the whip. Also this week, we have quite interestingly seen a couple of lockdown protests being scuppered in London. Videos emerged online of several hundred lockdown protesters being arrested. There was a couple of buses which were intercepted on the way to a train station, the majority of the people on said buses going towards a lockdown protest. It makes you wonder, how do the coppers know when the lockdown protests or anti-lockdown protests are going to be? We've seen this political policing quite recently, and it is getting rather scary, in my opinion. They didn't blink an eyelid at Extinction Rebellion or Black Lives Matter or whatever it may be, even though they were in breach of the exact same regulations that the anti-lockdown protesters are. But as it happens, they didn't even let them get to the demo, they just arrested them on the way there. Now, considering that these travel arrangements were done completely privately and between members of the group, it appears that the police must have actually somehow been infiltrated by the coppers. We don't yet know how, but unfortunately this is something that you have to deal with in a modern police state like the United Kingdom. Now to go north of the border into the People's Republic of Scotland, where Nicola Sturgeon has decided that she is going to, through any means necessary, I believe, try and come up with an independence referendum. Now, Seekers of Liberty, I'm not sure that this is something which we would necessarily disagree with on principle. I mean, the right to self-determination and smaller states and a federal system, so I've absolutely no problem with that. The interesting thing is, though, it seems to be that the only reason which she wishes to go for Scottish independence is to increase her own power. The SNP, who have ruled Scotland with an iron fist for nearly 10 years now, seem to have, they have this somewhat of a track record of just being completely authoritarian in their approach to anything. I mean, it's been most recently highlighted during the coronavirus pandemic. Any lockdown measures that were put in place by the United Kingdom government as a whole were kind of parroted, but a lot louder by Nicola up north. And it appears that she's hoping that independence will allow her even greater free rein on this issue. It's not quite clear how. Boris has said no. Nicola said yes, but it doesn't quite see. She says that she will hold one. I don't quite know under what pretext legally this will happen, but it will be interesting. It remains to be seen. Will she manage? I mean, it is the majority consensus now in Scotland that they do want independence from the United Kingdom. Really, I'm not saying I'd be sad to see them go. To be honest, if they want to stop spreading that socialist poison south of the border, that's no problem of mine. Having said that, it seems to have kind of creeped over already, so I don't think it'll change things much for us down here. Anyway, thank you for listening. That was Ed with 5 minutes.
And that's it for this week on the Libertarian Listener. Join us again next week when I have Chris Mendez of the Foundation Party on. Until then, don't forget to check us out on social media, and I'll see you again next week. Thanks for listening.